I feel like so many people talk about breakups, but not a lot of people talk about the aftermath of breakups, so that's obviously what we're gonna do today. Welcome back to my little cozy corner of the internet where I give you debrief after debrief after debrief, even though you didn't ask for it. In my last video, I was picking up where I left off 2 years ago when I made my last video, basically giving you a recap of the last breakup I went through and also giving you some tips as to how to move through a breakup and get towards healing. So if you haven't watched that, make sure to check it out. Now listen, those tips I gave you were absolutely factual, at least from my personal experience, but I'm not gonna sit here and lie to you and say that there weren't a slew of negative emotions that came up for me. So let's chat about them, because I do think the one thing that really helped me during the breakup was relating to other people who are feeling the same way. So I'm always pro talking about feelings. I think the number one biggest and hardest feeling to overcome was the guilt. As the person who was actually doing the breaking up, I carried so much shame and just overall guilt around the fact that I was hurting somebody who I cared about and who was once such an important part of my life. That was also compounded by the fact that us breaking up meant he had to move out, figure out his whole life. He essentially had to leave the country, move back in with his parents, quit his job. I can only imagine it was a really large transition for him, let alone the fact that you're already dealing with the emotional baggage from a breakup. If roles were reversed, I would crash out. At the same time, I feel like I was giving myself whiplash, because on one hand, I'm out here feeling super guilty, and on the other hand, I'm like gaslighting myself, being like, who do you think you are? Why do you think that you affected this person's life so much? So I was literally sitting there being like, am I an empathetic person or am I self-centered? Like what is the answer there? At the end of all of this internal dialogue, I feel like what really gave me peace was me thinking about the fact that it would have been more shameful to stay in the relationship knowing that my heart wasn't 100% in it. And if anything, I think the biggest guilt was not doing it sooner, because I had been thinking about it for so long. And then I started to think, oh, all of that time I could have given back to them and let them be free and let them figure out their lives. At the end of the day, in the grand scheme of things, an extra 6 months is not that big of a deal in our entire lives. And it could have gone either way. I could have broken up with him 6 months earlier and then worry that I didn't put in enough work to try and make it work. Or I could have done what I did and regret not doing it sooner. So honestly, there's no winning. I think that's the biggest thing is, if you're anything like me, I'm an overthinker. I spiral so easily, especially when I'm alone by myself. And so I was constantly going back and forth as to what the better outcome would have been, or what the better choice would have been in terms of the breakup and how I handle the breakup. But realistically, there is no perfect or ideal way to break up with someone. And so really there's no point in beating yourself up over it. Once I kind of got over the guilt of breaking up with him in the first place, then the shame kind of transformed into me being like, wow, I'm in my mid-20s and I have to start all over again. I know the girlies are gonna understand this. Every time you go through a breakup, especially when it's been like years of you dating that person, you're like, holy shit, I have to go on a first date again, meet someone new again, get them to know my entire life story and re-explain myself. The way that that was so unfathomable to me, like I was like, I don't have the energy for that. I'm gonna spend forever alone. Like that's the vibes. Also, I'm blinded by the sun ricocheting off of the building in front of me right now. Hopefully it's giving me a lovely little glow. What's crazy too is thinking back, that was like 2 years ago. So I guess when we broke up, I was either 25 or 26. And like, that's not even old. And I still remember after that breakup being like, holy shit, like I need to pick up the pace. I am 5 years away from being 30. It's gonna take me so long to reestablish trust and like a strong emotional connection with another person. By the time I find them and I get married, I'm gonna be 45. First of all, that's not how it works. The older you get, the less time it takes for you to connect with someone, because you're going into it with so much more experience than you did the previous relationship. And so assuming you're using that experience correctly, hopefully you're getting to a point where you are having the right conversations right off the bat. You are not entertaining anyone who is not meeting your standards. And all of those actions are going to severely speed up the process. We'll get to this episode eventually where I start talking about my current relationship, but the way we have skyrocketed and moved so much quicker than any other relationship, and it has felt so natural. I can't even imagine trying to explain our timeline to previous Sam's self, especially after the last breakup I had. But I'm telling you right now, it's hella possible. Then obviously another big emotion or feeling is loneliness, especially when you live with that person and you saw them and talked to them every single day. It is such a jarring and stark difference when you wake up and you have no one to talk to, no one to text, no one to say good morning to. And like I said, I'm an overthinker. So when I'm by myself, What am I doing? Overthinking. I actually remember making this video that went viral. It was on TikTok. Essentially, I was trying to articulate the fact that I felt really lonely, but there was no one I wanted to hang out with. It was like this empty, unfulfilled feeling inside where I didn't know what I wanted to do, who I wanted to talk to, or where I wanted to be, but I knew I wasn't happy where I was. And it's still to this day very hard to explain, but I think I was missing that part that your partner plays where you can just say anything and be goofy and be silly and not worry about how you're saying things or how you're putting together sentences or whatever. I feel like it's always been different with friends. Like I can catch up with them, I can talk to them, I can let loose, but there's just something about your partner, especially one that you live with, that you show a different side of. And I think removing that just left this kind of gaping hole of being like, I have all these things I want to do and want to say, but I don't know who to say them to. And that's probably honestly why I started making so many TikToks to begin with, is because I had so much to say and no one to say them to. So I guess it kind of worked out in my favor or whatever. Okay, this next part is actually what I find the most interesting in terms of the aftermath of the breakup. I feel like the guilt, the shame, and the loneliness are all things that happen right after the relationship ends. And then you kind of get to this like weird uncertainty limbo where you start questioning your identity. I'm not sure if it was just that one relationship, and maybe it was because I also made a bunch of videos with him, so he was integrated in a lot of my hobbies. But what I really struggled with after we broke up was rediscovering my identity. Obviously I have my personality and like who I am and what I like, but there was a part of me that was like, okay, what do I do now? Who am I? Like it was just really confusing for me. I kind of lost sense of like what I truly enjoyed doing on my own, how I wanted to express myself. Like everything was just kind of weird. I really struggled with making content for a while because again, I was making so much couple content with him. And while that limbo is really scary, it does force you to like kickstart your glow up and your better version of yourself and all the things you wanted to work on but never had the energy to do so. That's literally where I cut my bangs. I really developed my personal style. I could probably make a whole video just about the post-breakup glow up because I stand by the fact that a breakup is the best thing that could ever happen to a girl. There's no girl that goes downhill after a breakup, okay? It's only up. You might dip for a little bit, but then it's only up. Anyways, I'll do a whole video on my single era because that's a fun one for sure. Once you kind of rediscover your identity, I feel like you start looking back on your relationship without those rose-colored glasses. And what ends up happening is you start to see your relationship for what it truly was. And I don't know if it's just like a me thing where I can just remember the not so good and like less ideal things in the relationship better than the good things. But I kind of got to a place where I was like, oh, I don't really like my ex. And there's no part of me that still had like a soft spot for him at that point. I was just kind of seeing him for who he was and how he showed up in the relationship. In the same breath, you start to really objectively look at yourself as well and what part you played in the downfall of that relationship. And I think that was a really hard thing to look at myself in the mirror and be like, oh, you weren't so perfect either, bestie. And ultimately what came out of that for me was I started to not trust myself and my intuition and my ability to be a good girlfriend. Because at the end of the day, when you think about problems in a relationship, it's very, very rarely 100% one-sided. I don't think it ever is. And so when you start to look at everything from a bird's eye view and you look at it more objectively and your emotions are pulled out of it, you start to see a lot more clearly, okay, I was contributing XYZ and that's why I was getting XYZ response. Having those realizations is very uncomfortable because I would love to just sit here and believe that I'm a perfect angel little princess, but that's never the case. And it is important to sit in the discomfort of realizing that because at least you're learning and taking that experience hopefully into future relationships. But I think the biggest thing that kind of continued into my single era, which we will talk about more later, is the fact that I didn't trust my intuition. Like I didn't trust that I could look at something and be like, this person is not for me. It's tough because in hindsight, like everything's 2020. Of course, you can see it more clearly looking back than you can looking forward. But it's also so hard not to like kind of hold it against yourself, being like, of course, dummy, like why couldn't you see it? Especially if you have friends who also kind of could see it before, because obviously they weren't as involved as you were in the relationship. So honestly, I think the most work that I had to do after the relationship was really rebuilding the trust in myself, in my intuition, in my ability to make judgment calls and pick the best life for myself. And what I just had to keep reminding myself is you trust your intuition to leave the relationship, to risk being alone and risk not finding somebody else because you knew that wasn't your person. That's gotta be good enough for now. I'm so curious if these are like the same stages slash thoughts that other people go through after a breakup, because it's kind of like the 7 stages of grief, but also not at all. I know this was a really yappy video. That's kind of what I want to do with this YouTube channel, is just talk about things that happen and just make universal experiences feel more approachable and more talked about, because I think it is so important to relate to people even if they're through a screen. So if you like this kind of chatty video, I would love for you to subscribe. I always cringe a little bit inside saying that, but the next video is going to be a fun one because I'm going to give you the tea on my single era. We went through some highs and some lows in that era, okay? So you're going to want to tune in. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.